small feat to do this sort of thing, and Lois has done this before as well. There's a lineage in her work, a genealogy. I think she's in a different place in terms of what she's doing, which is interesting. It's a time-intensive labor of love that turns to hate at some point as well, much like dissertations, which then become books. So there's a lot of work, and it does, I think it's a miraculous feat, right, when we do these sorts of things. This book, more importantly, is dedicated to Lo's twins who are about to turn 1, Halen and Ansel. If you think about the last year or two for Lo, it sets new standards for creativity and productivity in terms of what is possible. So a celebration of that. I won't ask us to applaud, we can do that later. It's a book, though, that also begins with a mother who loses her son, who's shot by police, an African-American mother. And when we think about criminal justice in the United States, we're inevitably talking and thinking about the racialization of justice and violence and what that means. And as Lo pointed out, I'm very interested in the emotional work we do with that, and actors are doing. And loss is a framework that's not disconnected from harm in important ways that Lo points to. And I think it's interesting for us to think about the context that she's providing for us. So I'm going to talk about things I really like about the book, actually, and the kinds of questions that those sorts of attachments open up. Number one, I like this book as a criminologist because it challenges criminology. So first and foremost, it's asking us to rethink crime by thinking about harm, and maybe move away from crime altogether in a particular way. So crime as a legal category that's largely reactive in terms of responses that institutions have, defined by law in these ways that are not particularly meaningful if we really want to understand what people experience, what people feel, and what it means to think about trouble caused by another, as Lo defines it. And thinking about that, right, we run up against a lot of issues pretty quickly. Number one, it's overwhelming to think about all the trouble caused by all these folks. It's problematic, and I don't think it's any less appropriate for us as a point of inquiry because of that. We should be concerned about trouble that is caused by others. So it's an important starting point. And Lois talked about the reasons that she does that. I'm not going to reiterate it, but I was really intrigued with the way she points to how it might help us rethink empirically the patterns around particular kinds of demographics, along the lines of gender, race, class, age, etc. That it points again to this emotive experience. This particular line struck me very much. Lois says, "My heart is moved by the need to stop harm, but not always by the need to control crime. In fact, if you want me to tune out pretty quickly as a criminologist, start talking about controlling crime, because it's not, it's a place of disillusionment in a number of ways." So taking this stance where we look at harm a bit more carefully, a bit more thickly, and take it as our primary focus. That also means that we have to take into consideration something that criminology has historically omitted, and that is the tolerance of harm. So the very idea that there are a lot of folks, a lot of deliberate commissions, deliberate acts of harm that we disregard daily, that don't fall into the purview of criminology simply because they're not defined as crime. So we expand the territory, perhaps in such a vast way as to be overwhelmed, but I really don't care about that. I think it's important to do in terms of that. What else she does? She outright says, I'm going to take on a general theory. Here it is. Pretty ambitious, pretty epic. It's a general theory that also seeks to do this. It puts relatively, what we would often think of as unrelated or maybe incommensurable acts of harm in proximity to one another. I think those are both important things. One, a general theory, as much as we love to hate them and love to love them, they do a lot of the heavy lifting. They lay out everything, and then we frame our work around it, whether we're deconstructing or interrogating. That's a contribution, a big contribution for us to test, for us to explore. Future dissertations come out of this sort of work. It's important in that way. The incommensurability is important as well, because I think one thing that's really important is this is an exemplar of discourse analysis. Lo will be offering a course on discourse in the spring, first time we've been able to offer it. And what you try and do often in discourse analysis is take seemingly eclectic, unconnected things and juxtapose them and figure out what the limits and what the commonalities are in that. So important work being done there. In terms of generalizing and general theories, you run up inevitably against this tension, right, in terms of a need for historical, contextual, other kinds of cultural specificity. That's inevitable, and some of those things will probably materialize in response to this work. But that's a site for future work. So when it comes to thinking through genocide, criminology is way behind the scenes. When it comes to that, it's been disengaged from a lot of the literatures out there that have occurred. There's work emerging, but we're going to need a lot deeper work. We're going to need a lot more historical and contextual work. We need to understand, perhaps most importantly, why criminology failed to look at genocide in the first place. And that is a very intentional story. So something for us to think about in terms of all of that. But the acts themselves, I don't see them necessarily. I was struck in terms of my own reading, for instance, by the commonalities. When I read the chapter on animals as meat and meat eating, I already saw language there, as someone who studies punishment, that mirrored how we talk about the use value of humans as prisoners. And Lo later points this out. This is part of her synthesis, that there are these logics that are in place and that they're very strange and disconcerting, and that we should be attentive to them. So it was very familiar territory in a chapter that wasn't even focused on what I generally look at. I think there are probably real limits to what we can do with each of those harms as well in terms of comparison points, but it's worth the effort to lay all of this out as Lo has. So that's important. Going back to discourse, some things that really struck me. Lo begins this chapter where she's talking through discourse with "we are written." And it's true. Language is so instrumental. Words are performative, and they carry action in such important ways. When George Bush talks about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, as she points out, there are repercussions. When the Knox County Sheriff talks about stacking immigrants like cordwood, invoking genocidal language, there are repercussions. And there are repercussions when we decide to go buy burgers. And there's probably some relationships there that are really important, I think, for us to be thinking through. One of the things that I learned, one of the things that struck me, silences, absences are critical to discourse analysis because they create foreclosures in what we can think and know. And Lo talks about interviewees respondents who, they don't have stories about what they're talking about. And if we don't have stories, I was really struck by how we don't have a lot of meaning assigned to what we're doing. We haven't narrativized it, and we can't think our way out of it because we don't have any room for an alternative if there's no narrative to begin with. So she marks this in some ways as a defensive move to not think about what we're doing and to foreclose that. And we all engage in these acts of both language is action and language is foreclosure, silence is foreclosure. I wonder, one of the things that's interesting in terms of this causal logic is, and I think you have an answer for it, but those of us who are more causally leaning will wonder which came first, the story or the harm. But I think your answer is the story's always happening. The narrativizing is always happening before, during, and after. And we can't disconnect harm from that in those ways. So, and reduction is essential to that. In terms of what we don't say, how that also communicates, that defensiveness, I think, might be read a number of ways, right? It can reflect an absolute disregard or refusal to actually engage in terms of that issue. In some contexts, it might reflect something that's confusing or overwhelming, I was thinking. It also might reflect trauma in some instances, and who knows how deep that is. So lots of different things going on, I think, in that form of resistance there that we encounter. But it's a kind of reduction, ultimately, she says, that involves not recognizing, not even grasping most of what this other, this target, has going on. And so she makes a call out of that near the end for what she calls true stories. So, for the post-structuralist and being like, oh no, true stories, we don't want those. But we do want true stories in terms of what Lo is describing, because those are the stories that approximate the complexity of lived experience. So they're stories that can better tell about who we are individually, as opposed to reductions that capture this dynamism of living. So they're stories that are precarious, fluid, unfinished, incomplete, right, provisional. They're doing a lot of work in that regard. I was also struck too in terms of the power paradox. I kept running up against this in terms of wondering, in the case of genocide and intimate partner violence, when you see groups engaging in what genocide scholars will call frenzied killing, or when an abuser or perpetrator sees red or can't help themselves, there is this license, right, that occurs in that moment. I I just kept running up against the idea in terms of all of this. These are often men. There's a masculinity to these performances as well, particularly in these contexts of these two kinds of crime. I was wondering about patriarchy carrying a license to lose it with it in particular kinds of ways, and this hyper-emotional realm alongside of all of that. So part of the cultural story that can be further unpacked in additional work, I think, is looking at the role of gender, the role of race, all of these things alongside of this general theory in terms of all of that. I think the last thing that I'll point to, at the very end, Lois shifts to, I think, territory that's both important and relatively new in criminology, and territory she and I have both done work in. She positions restorative justice as a possible place in which to get better stories. And I've participated in some RJ kinds of frameworks, citizen circles in Southeast Ohio. I think it's very important. I've also been, as the alternative justice folks in here will tell you, Consumer, trying to really rethink justice, including the limits of restorative justice. When David Pello visited, some of you will remember, he pushed us on this idea of transformative justice without much of a vocabulary to talk about what that is. The communities and groups that I have worked with, some of them have very overtly resisted restorative justice because they don't want to restore anything. Not the structures that were in place, not the relationships that were violent, none of that. They want an alternative language altogether, and so those are groups that we're looking at this semester as well, that in that class, that really invoke this idea of transformative justice. It doesn't matter, though, because the last two words in the book are radical transformation, and we are both very much on the same page, I think, about that. And that's important for us, in a context where we're thinking through social justice daily here, to think through in terms of what that means. One other line I wanted to point to, because you just don't get these every day in books. The last chapter begins with, "We are after a kinder way of living and interacting with one another. Where should we start?" Sounds good. Sounds great to me. So I look forward to that dialogue, and thank you for the work.
I shouldn't have let her go first. For two reasons. One is, looking at her notes, I seemed rather ill-prepared compared to her, but also because she basically said everything I was going to say anyhow. First thing, for those who don't know me, my background, I come to this having been a police officer for many years, and so I have been in the background of in the criminal justice system. It's very much ingrained in these traditional styles of looking at harm and crime and those sorts of social issues. So in my graduate school process, I've kind of come to be at a different place, and Lois is kind of my mentor. And so I see, and I think I mentioned to somebody, I think I was talking to you, maybe I'm being a little, stroking my own ego a little bit, but I see marks of conversations that we had in here, that and things that she's asked me to read and I've asked her to read. So I was very impressed with the book. I can very much understand the difficult task that she had in putting this together, because it's very obvious to me that it's a massive undertaking to synthesize as much work as she did. Extraordinarily impressive. And I very much liked it. And one of the reasons why I very much liked it is because when I read these things, I have a tendency to be very critical of them and find reasons why I'm not going to like this. I'm one of those guys that when I first walked into grad school, they handed me a book of Jeffrey Ryman's The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison. I walked into my shift meeting at work and told all my squad mates, I said, "Look at this crap I've got to read." And threw it on the table. Now it's one of my favorite books, okay? So I started reading this with kind of this critical eye, and I'm thinking, okay, she goes from genocide to meat eating. What the hell is this? I mean, how can you draw some sort of moral parallel between genocide and eating a hamburger? And at that point, if it had been any other book or written by any other person under any other circumstances, I'd probably toss it on the shelf and be done with it. And then as I finished it out, then I'm like, okay, I get what she's doing here. She is very much suggesting that there is a parallel between eating a hamburger and genocide, and I think makes a fairly good, compelling argument for that. That basically she is suggesting that the ways that we rationalize our decision-making, our behaviors, have very similar contextual frameworks. They're grounded in our discourses, our narratives, how we see the world. And how we see the world is largely constructed by the stories we tell and the stories we are told. So I was very much impressed with that. That when I got done with this, I was like, oh, that's a pretty good book. I might even assign this to some of my students. That's how good it was, and I don't take that lightly. So and again, a lot of what I was planning on saying was what Dr. Brown has already said, but I'll add a couple of other things in here. One is, I thought I liked the framework that she laid out, because we know about theory, we want it to be nice and neat and concise. So in the book, I don't know if she mentioned it in her discussion, but Charles Tittles' control balance theory. I can see a lot of that in here, and I know that was an inspiration for this. The theory itself is grounded in this idea of power versus powerlessness, but it's such a clunky, big, theoretical idea that it's hard to really work with. And I think that she did a really, really good job kind of bringing some of these ideas down to a very concise form with this power paradox. I read it with this mind of, okay, when I've done harmful things that I know are harmful, how do I kind of construct this in my head, and it makes sense to me. And then target reduction, I think, is very interesting. One of the things I was particularly interested in was the genocide chapter, because atrocity is one of the research areas I'm interested in. And in it, she talks about dehumanization. And if any of you have done any reading at all in genocide theory, dehumanization is kind of like this core assumption that's always there. And up until this point, I was like, yeah, I get that. That makes sense. And she is saying, and citing other scholars that are saying the same thing, that that's not sufficient. There has to be more. That being categorized as not human is not enough. Our dogs are not human, but we won't eat our dog, right? Especially a dog we give a name to and love on and that sort of thing. So it has to be something else. You have to reduce them down even further to something that is not worthy of the status that you give people and animals and things that you love. Does that make sense? So when I did my dissertation research looking at anteater removal, she kind of shared this concept with me and said, hey, look at this. And one of the biggest things I found in the discourse surrounding justification for anteater removal was target reduction. Consistently portraying the Native American people as the Indian or this savage group of people. That there was not really any kind of understanding that these are a group of people that are human beings that have lives and see the world with their own set of beliefs and that sort of thing. So those two components I think they're pretty easy, at least for me, to wrap my mind around, and I really like that. And I saw, my note-taking is reflective of my eclectic thought process. So as I was reading through this, I'm jotting, oh wow, I could use this for this project, or excessive use of force in law enforcement is one of the things, I could use that. Thinking back to my law enforcement career when I probably used a little too much force on occasion, thinking what was going on in my head at the time, that could work. Thinking about the genocidal regimes, how did they justify that? I've started looking at, it's been suggested that we averted a genocide following the assassination of President Lincoln. How did that not come to fruition? I think that's something that could be looked at. The idea of target reduction. For those who do any policing, Van Manen, the asshole, that classic piece. How everybody else is the asshole. Doesn't matter that they're citizens or, or they're the criminal. I think this is very, very, very pertinent. So that part of it, I was very happy to read, because it's something that's usable, that you can build off of, because I very much see theories as tools as much as anything. I like that she recognizes the idea of harm from the victim's perspective, the idea that, I forget I'm paraphrasing to an extent here, but that many times harms are not recognized from the perspective of the harm doer, but the victim very, very much recognizes the harmfulness of those actions. I think that's important because our justice system does not do that. All of our harm in the justice system is defined as breaking the law or acting negligently in causing a harm. And so I think that this is an important component to the work that it brings to the table, this idea that we need to be looking at things differently. Let's see. I think one of the questions that people will ask is this idea of de-emphasizing intent, because many of the people who do research in my field here are grounded in, and kind of that's the point here, we're grounded in these preconceived understandings of the world that we study and we talk about. The people that are studying these problems are wrapped up in the same narrative structures as the rest of us. And I have a feeling when you go in, you start saying we need to quit worrying about intent so much, that's going to kind of stick in the craw of some people. I could see that being a problem. What else? Cultural logics, I like all that. I don't think there's anything particularly unique that I haven't already talked about. There were a couple things in here that I thought were pretty good, and I really like the target reduction. I made this really long note and about reducing the target. Just to kind of give you how much I like this book. On page 95, she makes this talk about target reduction, and I make this comment in the margin. It says, one's not a unique person. They're a criminal, a pedophile, a felon, a Jew, a crip, a blood, a terrorist. If one can successfully construct that abstract other as the enemy, anyone who can be, I can't read my writing here, one who can be connected with that group is excluded from the rights and privileges afforded to that group, right? Like, oh, this is great, I've come up with something really intelligent and smart here. And then like 4 or 5 pages over, where's this quote? And I thought it was phenomenal. Somebody said I should, like, just for effect, rip the book in half, and I said to do that would require me to break my iPad, and I don't want to do that. Now I can't find it. There it is. The quote, "The target of harm is my enemy, a Westerner, an inmate, a suspect, a terrorist, an Arab, an American, a communist, a savage, the prisoner, a faggot, she is a bitch, my wife, my woman, a cockroach, a nigger, a kite. It's flesh, it's meat. He's just a kid, she's just a hooker, it's just a fly, it is prey, it is my property." And I would almost dare say that every single person in this room, me included, has used this at some point. And I think that's very important to recognize, that really we are all agents of harm. We all practice acts of omission, turning our heads to things that we know is harmful, and we kind of justify and rationalize why we don't act. It's important with genocide. I think it's important with police misconduct. Why officers, we know the blue wall of silence, why officers see things happening and they don't do anything about it. And I think this theory can be used to talk about that. I can't say enough good things about it. I was really impressed. I can see people kind of lashing out at it a little bit because it definitely does kind of flip things on their head. Talk about under the chapter on interpersonal violence, portraying the offender, which is typically the man, as kind of a victim in their own right, who's committing a harm. That's going to be something people are going to bristle at. But that's good. I liked it. I remember I had a class, and I was the only guy in it. We got to talk about feminist theories, and I made a similar comment in class. I don't know if you remember this. And it was just like every lady in the room was like, "Don't hurt me." So I felt vindicated a little bit. But I really don't have anything else specifically to say about it. I like the restorative justice outcome because and actually that's an important point. The whole time I was reading, I was kind of like, okay, this is great, but what do we do with this? Because I'm a big doer. What do we use this for? And I think the restorative justice approach is it's important to kind of bring this in here and to bring this to the table, so when you have victims of harm and those who do harm and other community members who are here to address the harm, that they recognize that this is a dynamic process, that there's more to this story than this victim and this offender, and let's deal with this one particular problem, and then that's justice. But that's not sufficient. We know that's not sufficient. And so that kind of, what do we do with this, was very satisfying to me. So I think that's about it. Well done. Did you want to respond to any of the comments before opening it up?
Well, in the hallway, Rob, you mentioned that, and I wondered if this was a criticism, because it would be a really interesting criticism to me, that you're more concerned, you noticed that I'm looking at kind of more personal narratives as opposed to the broad discourses of the group.
Yeah, the comment was that Lo tends to look more at individual narratives of individual actors, where I'm more concerned with the more cultural narratives. So where she looks at offenders who, and I'm going to segue here, let me do a sidestep on this. Well, no, let me not. I'll go back to it. She'll look at the actual individual offender and look at how they construct their own narratives. I guess I'm framing this the right way. Whereas I'm looking, I say, okay, well, that's fine and good, but that comes from somewhere. Well, the somewhere is the cultural narrative, and that's what I'm looking at. So I don't know if it's really a criticism as
Right.
much as it is an observation that I think you could really, and frankly, use this for both. And it gets to what Michelle was saying, that really this narrative process is dynamic and ongoing, and it overlaps back and forth, and I think that's just part of it. Connected to that, I think that there will be a criticism of how do you measure this? It's the classic qualitative versus quantitative question. It's very subjective in a lot of cases. How do you do this? How do you collect this data? How do you measure it? You can't collect every story from every person at any given time, all the time.
Yeah.
And you know that, and I know that,
Yeah.
and we understand that, but I have a feeling that those who aren't in our wheelhouse will be like, well, this is nice, but we can't use it for anything because you can't quantify it. You can't digest a narrative down to a very simple statistical equation, which I think to me is a critique of our discipline as much as it is anything. And on that note, now my segue, I agree with what Michelle said as well. I've read most of your stuff, and I see a process. It's really kind of interesting to me as a new scholar to think. I find myself and many of the grad students, maybe the faculty here as well, when you start out, you're like, what the hell do I do with all of this? It really is a process. It's very impressive. It was cool to see it. Kind of like, okay, I read your earlier stuff, and okay, I see where you've gone with this. It's pretty neat. I enjoyed it.
Well, my only feedback or remarks are thank you for those comments and the appreciation. But I hope other people will have more critical.
Well, let's open the floor. We have probably half an hour.
Benjamin?
All right, I'm on board. I think you're absolutely correct that this is the direction of criminological theory. It's going to remain relevant in the coming decade. My question would be, how are your narrative explanations different from Sykes and Moss's
Good, that's a really good question. So neutralizations are sort of one shot, I'm denying the injury. I'm saying, oh, that victim is not a victim, or I'm denying responsibility. I'm saying I couldn't help it. And I think in my presentation today, it may seem that it's that code-like, but really, narrative criminology says what promotes crime or harm are the stories we tell about ourselves, and the stories are recountings of ourselves through time that make a moral point. So I think my short answer is it's a fuller explanatory variable than a neutralization. It's got more to it than those 5 neutralizations, very well known in criminology, these neutralizations. But I think it's friendly to that theory. And then, of course, they cut their teeth on delinquency, and then subsequent scholars have used it actually in fairly diverse ways, but still not in sort of everyday harm. So I'm sort of doing something else, both with that explanatory variable and with the outcome variable, I guess you could say. But I think that's a really good question. And I think I could see a criticism being, well, this is really nothing new, I like that, I don't think it has to be. I set out, I think, early in the book that this is quite a bit of a synthesis of things other people have said. And some of my slides really show you other people who've said the stories that we told allowed us to do this. And also, I think my juxtaposition of target reduction and the power paradox is somewhat, it's formulated a bit differently than I've seen. So, I appreciate that. Yeah, and Nick?
Yeah, I'm I'm curious about the power paradox insofar as it seems like it can be generalized very, very widely to include harm with things that often, at least some people normally would conclude it. Something like normal social science can be viewed as harm, right? Because you're actually reducing people like subjects, right? Like they're subjects, they cease to be humans. And you have this sort of thing that you adhere to above yourself that allows you the right justification or ability to do so, right? Or even like passing moral judgments on other people in and of itself seems like it would become a form of harm, right? Because like this is sort of like the Levinasian, like I can't pass judgment on someone without reducing the infinity of the other. You have the one end, and then often those moral codes come from something else that legitimizes them, right? So like this is less a question or comment,
Yeah.
or lobbing something to you to get your comment.
No, I love that point, that it explains harm, but it also explains like everything else we do. You know, it just explains everything. You know, and I mentioned in the book that the power paradox is in a sense how we live. You know, we live between a phenomenology of constraint and ability. You know, we said that's exactly where we live. Like, I feel like I have to teach this class next. I'm authorized to, you know, like, you know, there's agency, there's structure. So I acknowledge that point, and I don't really know what to do with it, although you started with your example of doing social science and how that's reduced. I don't think that's what, I'm not sure that's reduction. I mean, you're reducing data to variables so that you can do SPSS, but are you reducing, are you narrowing the interest? Well, I guess you are. Yeah, I acknowledge that point back at you.
And I think you even I was looking for here, I think you even addressed that a little bit in one of the final chapters, that there's this tendency even for scholars to kind of go in and want to fix things, and that sometimes doing good is harmful because we come at it from our own paradigms and our own worldviews. I don't exactly remember. Do you remember?
No,
Let me
I
see if I
don't
find it
remember
here.
that. But I mean,
Maybe I read
mean,
into your
it's
work.
certainly, Nick's point certainly, or one way you can read his point is that there's a whole lot more harm than, you know, there's a lot of harm.
Yeah, can I jump in? She uses Levinas, so she actually applies in a couple of points, I think. But the way I was thinking about that problem, Nick, was that there's another book here, and there's another story, and it's called Why We Do Not Harm. And it's kind of trying to approach it from that reverse angle and looking at the conditions under which some other alternative set of possibilities. So, you know, the school shooter doesn't shoot anybody. What happened that day? What's going on?
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, you
I
were
just
just
mentioned that today.
Yeah, he was just talking about that kind of thing. Yeah, Jules?
Lois, it's a really good question. I can't wait to get my hands on this book. But I was just curious, looking at criminology, when we've been okay with accepting deviant behavior and some things that aren't necessarily crime.
Then you just speak up so people are back.
I'm sorry, I was asking about deviant behavior in criminology and delinquency studies. That Wine's emiology is suddenly so shocking that we would bring that in when
Right.
I've seen criminologists studying tattooing and
Right.
things that
Like
are...
they've taken on like the deviance, which is the old.
Yeah,
they've
and
taken
sort
on
of
also-
it seems to be more acceptable in some ways than this. Is it like this inevitability that we feel with harming? Is that that all around us now we're told just living in this world that...
Maybe because it begs reflexivity, like, okay, well, why am I, you know, the meat eating comes to mind all the time for me, but, you know, why did I just run a red, you know, so maybe it's because it sheds a light on our actions. Michelle?
I'll let you, the author handle
So,
that.
Sorry.
yeah.
I guess just, is it though that criminologists are scared of the inevitability of harm, that we can't, that criminology as sort of this subdiscipline has it?
I think it's an interesting question because I think they are protective about those boundaries. Like they will look at the transgressive to a certain extent, but to really open it up, I think there's a real resistance to that. There have been recent pieces published saying we need to bring back crime as a category. We need to bring back law and punishment. These are meaningful categories for us as criminologists. I think they are, but why there's that pushback to bring them back against this other kind of work that some of us are doing is interesting.
Yeah.
It's defensive.
Yeah. John? Oh, sorry.
So I got a pair of sort of philosophical questions for y'all. Coming from a religious background, I was kind of raised on the idea that indifference is worse than hate. And the first question I have for you is sort of where does indifference fit into this model? And the reason I'm asking that is because when I was listening to the quote that he was reading, it almost seems like they're reducing people to meat. It almost seems like there's something much more than indifference going on. So my first question is, where does indifference fit in? And second, is indifference still worse than hate? Did the rabbis get that one right, or should it be the other way around?
Yeah, to tell you the truth, well, I address indifference and it does, I appreciate this question because it does sort of, it undermines my quest for generality, I think, because like I said, there's this sadism and joy about some harm, and then there's just like going along with other harm, including the vast amount of indifference. And actually, I think that the bigger threat to criminology is the impact of just being apathetic. And that really, because it blows intent and it's just harmful in ways that we can't even measure. So I do discuss that, and I imagine an actor who's kind of carried along by the discourses from above. So I'm not sure, frankly, what to do with that as far as me telling. So if I just go up to that table and eat some grape leaves that have meat, and I don't even care, I'm hungry, and so I don't know if in that moment I'm telling a story as much as I'm sort of just kind of connecting myself or tethering myself to a discourse of just doing whatever, and it's okay, I'm allowed, and I see Michelle, whoever shakes their head, I'm like, yeah, jump in. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm addressing this on the fly based on what I gathered out of this. I think she addresses this to an extent, talking about bystanders, and it came out really in the chapter on eating meat. For instance, she quotes, I think it was a gentleman who basically said, "Tell me about your meat eating," and there was this awkward pause, and they were like, "Well, I can see this in my head because this would be me. If someone had sat down and asked me that question out of the blue, I would have been like, huh?" Then it's like, well, what do you want to know? It's kind of like this question of what
So
the
it's
heck
the
are
no
you-
story thing.
They don't know. They don't, and you address this. There are these harms out here that this is kind of the point that these narratives exist that kind of pull a curtain down in front of us. We don't recognize harm.
Well, and this reminds me of Jennifer Shalley's
Yeah.
work, and she's going to be looking at agribusiness websites and how they sort of put a curtain, like they sort of just carry us along with their own rhetorics of everything's great at Tyson, we're a happy family, and it's just a kind of anesthetization. But what this has to do with my main argument, I think there is some tension there between them that I recognize. Yeah.
I kind of want to find out which way you were approaching harm when it came to meat eating. Were you approaching the harm that it did to the animals, or are you approaching the harm that it does to people, not necessarily by eating it, but the environmental
The
harm?
former.
The
Yeah, I was emphasizing the harm to animals.
just the harm to animals. Well, then, I guess another question on that, and I know you don't really address this in your book, but if, say, you were to go eat meat right now, you were to go eat a cheeseburger, and even though you knew that you were doing harm to the animals, would it still be considered harm? Would you be responsible for the harm that you were doing for the people who were suffering from the environmental conditions, or would that be the responsibility of these corporations that kind of put the veil up like you were talking about?
Well, I think both.
Both?
That's my thought. I feel like John had a second part, and Damayanti also had a question.
And the second question?
Yeah, you said you had two questions.
Yeah, the second question was, the old adage that indifference is worse than hate. Do you still think that's true, or does your research make you think that the opposite might be true?
Yeah, I don't have any empirical way to weigh in, and I'm very sympathetic to that point that it's worse, that it's and Kyle's read Stephen Bach's critical criminologist from the 70s and 80s has a famous quote about, you know, when you're indifferent, anyone could suffer. Whereas if I want to kill Douglas, it's like I hate him, but this is like, you know what, you know, anybody could suffer, and so it's that much worse. So I'm on my own moral grounds. I'm sort of lean that way. But
there's a lot of Arendt in the book. I was struck by how much
Hannah Arendt
is in the book, and I thought a lot about, you know, this idea of thoughtlessness, the work we do to not think about these kinds of things in connection with the point.
And I think that you can use this, and I think she did, at least maybe passively, and I read into it more, but that the same discourses are used. It's kind of like my genocide seminar I taught, the student who said, well, why should I care? Those people don't affect me. I'm more worried about my family, so you're reducing this other group of people and claiming some powerlessness. There's nothing I can do about it anyway, besides I got to worry about my family, so I can protect these people but not these people, right? Yeah. And those people don't really matter anyway because I'm worried about my family, so you give this privileged status. And quite frankly, I think it's legit in a lot of cases, but I still think the framework works for that indifference. Or the bystanders in the genocide, why do they see and not see? Because they construct that narrative.
Diane.
I want to congratulate you on the book.
Thank you.
It's interesting. I'm not a criminologist, but I probably, this is all new to me, but it seems it could be useful for criminologists as well as for others who are trying to understand these kinds of questions. My only question is, it seems like you're looking at these three very different forms of harm that could happen, and there are really wonderful possibilities with that. But I was just wondering what do you think about the dangers of kind of conflating all these forms of harms to, you know, acts of intent? And the reason why there's an additional question that's tied to that. Recently, I've been reading some work on poverty and structural violence and how poverty could be viewed as structural violence, particularly in the context of India. And I was looking at how, in spite of 50 years of number of poverty amelioration programs, the number of people who are poor is very high. And these are people who regularly, on an everyday basis, face violence from pushing their lives to the edges, trying to feed their families, continuously feeding these kinds of violence, which in a lot of ways is normalized by the state. But the state also has these programs to ameliorate it. It just doesn't work for a variety of reasons. So I was just wondering if you only say see violence and harm as kind of this intentional acts. Does it put us in danger in certain ways by not looking at these kinds of underlying structural factors?
Yeah, so I make an argument that we ought not to privilege intention, that we should take into account harms that aren't intended. Now, your point about this, I mean, I would almost break off your point about, what about the structural forces that are behind such, structural violence, and the cultural sociologist in me is saying, yes, those, there's those, those policies, those international agreements, this, that, and the other, but they only got pulled off through texts, and so that's where I'm entering. What are those texts that allowed them to be disseminated and sustained today, and so that's like the work I'll do.
It's the cycle. It would be the...
Well, in your work, yeah.
Right.
The structural and the cultural sort of mutually supportive. Oh.
It's a fascinating work. I'm really enjoying the discussion and the book and the parts of it that I was able to read for today, so I had a little heads up too. I was wondering, because you're framing narratives as culture, and I start from a position that's rather skeptical of narratives as causal in any case, so that being said, go ahead. But I don't I'm wondering why you want to reach for a universal theory of harm, and what is American about these narratives of harm. And the only chapter that it seems to me that gets to a non-American is the genocide chapter. And yet Rob's work deals with the American narrative of Indian removal and harm here. And so when I think about, you know, these kind of you know, vignettes of other cultures who might, or religions, who might apologize to an animal before killing it, rather than just mindlessly eating it, I wonder whether, you know, there's room for different cultural stories, but also behaviors and attitudes towards harm, and whether that makes a difference to a theory of harm.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great criticism, that it's most likely, I mean, this is my slice of the world that I've done, and I think that will rest as, you know, possibly this meta-narrative I'm constructing won't work. Why did I want it? Because I think, you know, I sort of have to explore my own motives, but I think it comes from really being a well-trained criminologist who's used to general theory. You know, we are pretty good at good at general theories, and so in a sense, that's where I'm coming from. Like, well, I don't like that general theory. Let me come up with a general theory. But I think that's an apt criticism. But you said something first that I thought was there a first question that I thought was that I wanted to respond to?
I don't know. I have another one.
Oh, yeah, well, okay.
Any skeptical
Need another
narratives is
one.
I'll add another one, and I don't know if you addressed this
Something about
somewhere
narrative.
in the book. Well, narratives as culture was where I started. But the other thing, which maybe could relate to Americanness, is, and I see it in certain disciplines, but also as a very American thing to look at individuals. And so it's interesting the tension you pose when you say you want to get away from agents and crimes. But some of the harms I would categorize as more individual level harms, right? When you're talking about, say, domestic abuse, you're talking about an individual being harmed. If you're talking about a system of meat eating or a system of genocide, then the harm is less individual. So I'm wondering, how do you, or does it matter? How do you think through these sort of different levels of analysis of harm?
Well, I don't know if I agree with your own distinction, because, you know, domestic violence, there are patterns of such across countries, and, you know, there are periods in time when violence against women is on the ascendant and is less. So, in terms of
I mean, it's tied up a little bit with direct versus indirect. I mean, that decision to, I mean, are you harming the animal, right? So and it's in part distancing. And I don't know whether the distancing is one of the logics. I mean, I think when I think back to Rob's dissertation, I think about distancing as well. And when we think about actually commodity chain work, we think about, you know, one of the problems with seeing the harm to workers halfway around the world is that they're halfway around the world. And so I wonder about, you know, harms where domestic violence, you're talking about people in, you know, hand-to-hand relations with one another.
Yeah. So the direct versus indirect, I understand. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that would be, I would colonize that problematic by saying, well, that's what shapes or that's a factor that shapes reduction, or processes of reduction. But I think the work has yet to be done to really get clear on, you know, here's, and this is in a way picks up on your point about, you know, here's that level of harm or that aspect, and here's the other. And I mean, you know, any one harm enterprise is that complicated. And so I kind of had stepped into some doo-doo with that, you know, with the direct versus indirect. And I think I'm more at fault. In other words, it's not me being, you know, sort of having, it's not me pioneering something to have, you know, not fessed up to American, you know, the Americanness of the work. I think that, I have to think about that, but I think I'm pretty ready to say, yeah, it's that narrow. Yeah.
Well,
Well, even with meat eating, I mean, you could do the direct versus the indirect, whether you're actually hunting or fishing or catching the food yourself or raising it yourself, or whether you're getting it from these places that you have no idea where it comes from. So
Right.
it's kinda, I don't know if you address that in your, or if you just focus on the factory farm.
In the book, I talk about meat eating.
Just in general.
Eating mostly. In an article that I wrote with Bill Taylor, who I don't think is here, we did what we called an autoethnography, and he hunts and fishes, and I don't do those things. And we talk about what we think are cultural inspirations for our different participation in this, farm enterprise is. So I address it there. It's called an autoethnography of hunting. And, yeah, where I'm going with that. Is there somebody, okay, Nick.
Not to get too meta here, but it seems like identifying harm is in fact a form of harm, right? Because like if I say like, oh, people who eat meat do this, I've reduced them to a group and then use this abstract structure to then apply upon them. So like, how do we identify harm without causing harm? If we're going to say that identifying harm is somehow superior to other forms of harm, we're still morally good because we're identifying harm, then we seem to have to construct sort of a meta theory of harm that would allow us to explain when harming is okay or is not okay, or just admit that all harm is sort of at this level.
Well, and that meta theory would be an ethical theory, right? It would kind of go beyond social science as we know it. Sure.
Wasn't that kind of built into your definition of harm?
Yeah.
That there's not really a moral component to her definition of harm. It was just like we've acknowledged that harm is any action that causes.
Trouble,
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. That's reductive. Yeah.
Reflexively thinking about it.
Yeah. And Michelle?
Well, first, join the course. Huge congratulations. I'm so excited to still be here. I have like 3 kids in school. I really liked what you just said about we all live in a harm enterprise. And what struck me about that is how that kind of very parsimoniously brings together those different links of your theoretical framework, the cultural aspect, the narrative aspect, and the structural systems aspect and the different levels of analysis. That was my first question. Oh, we're come on, change.
You can elaborate.
Yeah, no, I can figure it out. But if these different kind of components of the larger theory that you're creating has different actors behind it, how do we begin to think about how you're framing justice? And I know, like, Michelle brought this up in her comments, and you didn't bring it up on your PowerPoint, so I haven't read the book, and actually, I have to admit, I don't know a lot of restorative justice literature. I know the transformative that you brought up too, but it makes me think about when that process begins, who are those actors you're inviting to the table? Because you have this individualist level, you have this societal, cultural making of these narratives, and then you have this systems of global frameworks and all this stuff where it gets really messy. So as we're all in this department and we want to start to think about justice and how we begin to implement it in our own lives and what we teach our students, how does this work in a harm framework?
That's such a good, I should write that down, because when we do critical discourse analysis, like, okay, all these harms or all these bad things are getting done through these texts, but then when we turn to questions of doing social justice, like, yeah, there's a table and with chairs, and you can't bring a text. You can't say, okay, I'm going to put all these texts around the table, including texts that pacifize or that de-responsibilize. So it would have to be persons, and those persons would have to be, they would represent those tendencies, those discursive strategies. So, but you're sort of reminding me that I wonder about that. A critical discourse analysis it's good work, but it would sort of be trouble for then justice work. Except that restorative justice, it has this discursive strategy of like confronting what's problematic about the way we're talking about things, and it very explicitly does. I mean, there's very many practices, but they tend to privilege talking and upending talk. So I think that becomes one answer, that we have a justice practice that deals with texts, that addresses texts.
I think that's explicit in her final chapter too. She's talking about starting the conversation, and you use the phrase discussion-oriented protocol and sociological curriculum that would interrogate harm-promoting discourses.
And as an aside, the American Bar Association just published, I think, an ABA journal a couple months ago, how these perspectives should be used more frequently in our justice system.
What perspective?
Just restorative justice,
Oh,
and these
really?
new, discourse-based practices that basically even the legal profession is recognizing that this history of retributive and procedural justice isn't sufficient.
Right, good.
Well, maybe there's a good place to stop. I'm sure there's still a few minutes left for informal conversation.
Well,
Finish up.
I have one question
Oh.
that needs to be answered. What do we call this theory? So when I start citing Bresser's theory of, Bresser's theory of harm, I'll done deal.
One more.
Thank you.